Hey up campers, Johnny Matthew here. Welcome back to the blog. This is one of my kind of blog pods, so it's the voiceover of the text blog that you can get at johnnyvm.substack.com. Welcome back if you've been here before. If you haven't, welcome. It's great to have you here. You can help the work for as little as $5 if you would like to. Just click on one of the blue buttons over in Substack and you can do that. But of course, you're welcome to this for nothing at all. So here we go. This is the first of two posts about object permanence. Object permanence number one. What it is, why it matters, and how it can go wrong. Introduction. A 13-year-old anxious toddler. I recently observed a young man in a residential setting who seemed genuinely unable to leave his carers alone. If they got up to go to the kitchen, or anywhere else for that matter, he followed. When they went to the bathroom, he'd stand outside the door and talk to them through the door. He stood uncomfortably close during conversations, or even if there was no discussion going on at all, often just standing with the side of his body right up against the adult's body rather than at a discreet distance or across the room as you might ordinarily do. He did lots of hugging, including spontaneously walking across the room to hug a person who'd been there the whole time. It's not like they just came in or something. As if physical contact was necessary to convince him that they were there and that all was well. He is a school refuser, not a term that I like particularly, but he was much happier and content, and his behaviour was more measured and regulated if he stayed at home. But when the home tutor came to work with him, he liked to always have a member of care staff in the room too, and so on it went. So my conclusion from all of this was that, among other things, he'd not properly developed what psychologists call object permanence. So what is object permanence? Object permanence is the understanding that objects, including people, stuff, things, continue to exist even when they're not visible. It's an early fundamental milestone in cognitive development that infants largely acquire in the months before they can speak, or certainly they make huge fundamental progress during that period. So usually by the time they're around about 8 months to a year old or thereabouts. Now, if a child's development is such that they're not able to acquire object permanence, at least not fully or in a balanced way, this can lead to problems later. In a general sense, this may leave them insecure, anxious, and or with memory or learning problems. More of this as we go through. Firstly, the development of object permanence in infants. Sensory motor stage. So this is birth to 2 years old. So this is really general, of course, and then I'll break down the first year to make it a little bit more granular, just to set the context of the thing in child development. So the sensory motor stage, birth to 2 years. Now this, of course, is according to Jean Piaget, known by many, and I guess out there in the world as the father of cognitive development. But according to his articulation of this first 2 years of life, infants develop object permanence during the early part of this period, which lasts from birth to around about 2 years of age, but the actual development of object permanence will be early in that. Now, there are some more recent studies, and I've put a link in the post, that suggests that object permanence may at least partially be developed as early as 3 to 4 months old. But whichever is right, there is general wide agreement that it's early on in child development and within the first year for sure. So let's just break down that first year just to give us a little bit of granular development and look at the progression. So there are 3 bits to this: birth to 4 months, 4 to 8 months, and 8 to 12 months. Now, of course, as always with any of these things in child development, particularly in pre-verbal stuff like this, we're reliant on observation, experiment, and research, all of which to some degree require inference, because these are precognitive human beings and can't kind of give us the primary data that we might ordinarily rely on. Anyway, birth to 4 months. Infants primarily interact with people and objects through reflexive actions and don't yet understand that they exist before and or after that immediate moment. So the child just responds there and then. So we may be playing with a teddy bear. The child has little or no sense of the teddy existing or having had being, if you like, before the play, or indeed after it ends. It's really all about here and now, and that's all there is. So that's the birth to 4 months. 4 to 8 months, babies begin to recognise that objects have some continuity. So they may reach for partially hidden items, toys, whatever, for example. So that indicates a kind of emerging awareness and the beginning of kind of cause and effect reasoning. In other words, like, for example, I can't see all of the teddy, but what I can see suggests that there's more there that I can't see. Ergo, the whole teddy exists, even though I can't see it all. So they're in the beginning stages, I guess, of building mental representations. Then at 8 to 12 months, infants start to actively search for completely hidden objects, demonstrating a developing sense of object permanence, e.g., the pre-verbal equivalent of, I can't see the teddy, but I think it might be under this blanket or in that toy box. Now, they don't maybe have linguistic cues, certainly, that they can speak yet for these things, blankets, toy boxes, teddies, but there's a sense that I've got that teddy in my mind now, even though I can't see it. So when we're playing with the kid and the teddy, and we're playing peekaboo, and the teddy popping up and makes the child jump, and it's all hilarious, when they get to this later stage, 8 to 12 months-ish, that's not really funny anymore, because the child knows, again in this pre-verbal way, they've got a mental representation that says this child is just, mum's just holding it down the side of the settee or behind her back for it to jump out. So that knowing is object permanence. I can't see it, but I know it's there. It's a mental representation. So in other words, at this point, the child's reaction or lack of it to the peekaboo idea is a clear demonstration that they've attained some mental representation of the teddy. It's not a visual recognition, because the teddy isn't visual, but it's now held in mind. It's a mental representation. So despite not being able to see it. So that's why it's not funny anymore. So all right, so let's that's broadly what object permanence is. Let's look at what its absence might bring. I will have a few seconds break to drink my coffee, and then we'll get back to this. Okay, the impact of not developing object permanence. Though on its own, object permanence is just one aspect of child development, failure to develop it can contribute to challenges in cognitive and emotional development, for example. Now, as always, I'm going to give you some examples of this. This is nowhere near an exhaustive list. These are the kind of immediate things that came to mind and that I picked up in doing some reading for this post. So I'm going to look at 4 kind of broad, and they are really broad, areas that might be affected by a lack of object permanence, and of course all the other sort of associated developmental bits that usually come when that's the case. So I'm going to talk very briefly: attachment issues, separation anxiety, cognitive delays, learning difficulties. So attachment issues. Difficulty in forming secure attachments due to an unstable perception of the caregiver's presence. This can extend into later development, bringing with it relationship difficulties like problems with trust, tendency not to ask for help, or perceiving adults, particularly caregivers, as unreliable. So I guess if we're seeing object permanence as the child's mental representation of something they can't see, now if the person who they learn that through, that's nearly always the primary attachment figures, if they are inconsistent or harmful, or they introduce trauma into the relationship, or they're unsafe in some way, or there's no predictability about the care, then clearly that will affect a whole raft of issues. But object permanence will be one of them, and that's got an attachment link. Separation anxiety, secondly. So without understanding that caregivers continue to exist when they're out of sight, infants may experience heightened distress during separations. Again, it's the absence not only of the adult themselves, physically and visually, but of any mental representation of the adult that leaves the child a bit more bereft. So over time, children very slowly and gradually will learn that, mum is not in the room playing with me, but I can hear her in the kitchen. I know, here she is, she's back again. And so slowly they develop a sense of she's not here, but all is well. And that kind of all is wellness is a reflection of this building mental representation, which we call object permanence. So separation anxiety, conversely, gets worse over time, or can get worse over time, because if the child has not learned that this person returns and therefore I can increasingly deal with absences, if they continue in the state of anxiety and that worsens over time, not only is it in the moment tricky for the child, they're also not building the mental representation they need to feel okay, and so they will be more anxious and then potentially a lot more distressed. Thirdly, cognitive delays. Children may experience delays in the development of memory and perception of the environment. Difficulty in forming and retaining mental representations of objects and people can hinder problem-solving skills and abstract thinking later on. It's kind of a deficit in the mental life, I suppose. It can also impact the development of working memory. So if a child struggles to form mental representations of things and people, then keeping them in mind or remembering them, even in the short term, can also be affected. So there's a kind of, small-scale cognitive delay that gets introduced, a kind of impact in the development of the usual kind of cognitive apparatus. And then fourthly, learning difficulties. Now, in extremis, a chronic lack of object permanence, and of course all the other associated, particularly attachment and other issues that come along with it, may contribute to learning difficulties, such that they struggle with tasks which rely on working memory or spatial awareness, as we've said. So these are likely to be less obvious at first than the separation anxiety, for example, because that comes out in behaviour and lots of crying and clinginess. But the learning issues will develop over time and become apparent a little bit later on. If you can't employ working memory very well, then your ability to fully take advantage of learning, both generally at home in the world and in school as the child grows and develops, is also compromised potentially. So those are some of the broad areas that can be affected. Attachment-related stuff, separation anxiety, which again falls under that attachment banner, I suppose. Cognitive delays, learning difficulties can all be affected if the milestone of object permanence isn't achieved in a timely way. So in the next post, I'm going to expand this, but just some final thoughts. Separating out one aspect of child development like we have here isn't ideal because children develop across a range of domains all at the same time, and they necessarily interact and reciprocate their impacts on each other. But understanding single kind of concepts and aspects like object permanence can help us to understand more clearly, fully, deeply, and functionally, I think, about how kids develop in such a way that we can help them more effectively. Another of my conclusions from observing the 13-year-old toddler I mentioned in the introduction was that his behaviour was absolutely exhausting for his carers. They got very little peace. But then neither did he. But understanding his needs in a developmental way like this meant that the staff, able to remain patient and put in place some strategies to help him recover the lost ground from his early years. So to that end, in the next post, I'm going to share some ideas and strategies we can use at work or at home that can help kids to recover some of the ground they've lost or missed around this. So that's the next post, Object Permanence 2, what we can do about it. I hope this has been useful to you, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers.